What I'd like to do with this podcast is demonstrate with some illustrations from real life the value of the essay Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. My belief is that it's like a manifesto for living your best life, feeling best about yourself, and having the most integrity. It's a powerful essay by itself. He was a really pithy, gritty writer and also a poet. He was writing in the 1800s, so sometimes it's difficult to read, at least the first few times you read it. That's why I wrote my translation. I have a book called Self-Reliance Translated. But you read it a few times or listen to it, and you'll get that he's really saying something valuable there. And he says it in a way that is very memorable. And this essay is quoted a lot. Traveling is a fool's paradise. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. Imitation is suicide. Or, here's my favorite, I must be myself. I will not hide my tastes or aversions. I will so trust that what is deep is holy, that I will do strongly before the sun and moon whatever inly rejoices me and the heart appoints. Which is probably the first thing I should mention as a good example of applying the principles in this essay is I'm making podcasts, right? And it seems like the most professional way to do these podcasts is to write it all out, edit it really well, and then read it. But I don't really like doing that. I don't like listening to somebody that's reading very often. I mean, I'd much rather hear somebody that's just speaking. It comes out more naturally. It goes into my ears more naturally. It's easier to understand, and I want that. I wanted to make this so that that's what this podcast was. It was natural speech, which makes it a lot harder to do. Or not harder to do, but I make more mistakes. And sometimes when I'm done, it doesn't feel like it's complete. Like, oh, I should have put that in there. But it's natural. It's like natural speech. It's exactly what I'm trying to create here. And I really love it. It inly rejoices me. And I want to keep doing it, and I want to keep getting better at it. And my natural inclination is to think that there's going to be people that listen to this and go, why doesn't he just do it the way you're supposed to do this? And in fact, some people I know that know me have listened to it and not really liked it, didn't really like what I was doing, which is applying another thing that he says in that essay, which is, quote, what I must do is all that concerns me, not what the people think. I think this is a good idea, and I want to create it. And it makes it really enjoyable for me to create it this way. Probably some people won't like it, but there's working on 8 billion people in the world. I'm sure somebody's going to like it. And I'm sure some people are going to hate it. There's another quote by Emerson in this essay. For nonconformity, the world whips you with its displeasure. So when you're doing something like this, something creative, you have the choice between either doing what you want to do, the way you want to do it, or doing what you think people will like, or doing what you see other people doing. And one of the points he makes in this essay is that the universe will not ever want to duplicate itself, will not ever want to repeat itself. And I believe that that is a great way to think about it, that you want to be what you are, because you are unique, and you want to do what you want to do, because that also is unique. People have already done themselves, but nobody's done you before. So that's one example of self-reliance applied. I'm doing what inly rejoices me, and I'm not worrying about what other people think. What I must do is all that concerns me. And my reward is that I'm doing something unique, and I get to feel good about what I'm doing, and I look forward to doing it. I enjoy doing it. And ultimately, probably, I will get people that like what I'm doing and like it because I'm doing it the way I'm doing it. And if not, I'm having a good time. That's another thing he talks about in that essay, is that you can't really predict what is going to be successful. And you can't alter your own behavior in order to do what you think is going to be successful, because you never know what's going to be successful. And that's the temptation that you've seen something else. You've seen somebody else do something, and they were successful, and so you want to duplicate what they're doing. But part of what made them successful is probably that they're doing something completely unique. So you can't really copy it and be successful with it, or you don't know if you can or not. There's no guarantee of anything. But you can know with certainty what you want and how you want to do it. And that's something you can stand on. That's something firm you can stand on. One of the things that Emerson really emphasizes in his essay is that you must be yourself, even with people that you care about. And this principle is really important in any relationship. If you can't be honest with somebody that you love, to that degree, you are not close to them. That's just the way it works. When you're hiding something you're not saying, they don't know you. And you know that they don't know you. And so you feel a little distant. And as those accumulate, you feel more and more distant. It's the painful truth that you have to say it, that you have to be honest. And you don't have to be brutal about it. And you can be as tactful as you possibly can, and as kind as you can, and as complete as you can, including the good stuff. But it has to be said, or you're not close to each other. And as Emerson would say, it scatters your force. It makes you weak to not say something because you're afraid to hurt somebody's feelings. Now, this may not apply, obviously, at work or, in more superficial relationships. There's a place and a time for it. But if you want to be a really good friend or be really close with someone you love, honesty is the only way to get there. And that takes courage, and your mind will buck against it. But if you want to stand on your own 2 feet and be grounded in the truth, you have to say the truth. And like he said, sometimes it ends up being a benefit, even if they don't like it when you say something originally. It ends up benefiting them because really the world's got enough nonsense and lies and misinformation and deceit. The world does not need any more of that. What the world really needs in every little nook and cranny is honesty. And I know that's easier said than done. I've been struggling with it my whole life. I was taught to be polite, and I want to be polite, and I want people to like me. I want to be approved of. I want people to think well of me. And sometimes honesty really works against that. But that's the price you pay for being self-reliant and a force of nature. One of the things that Emerson points out is that if you perceive something, then people after you can perceive it, even if you may be the first one to ever perceive it. And he also encourages people to rely on their own honest observations rather than on what other people believe, even if other people are against you. And a good historical example of that principle applied, is the case of Ignaz Semmelweis. He was in the mid-1800s. He was in Austria, in Vienna, and he noticed that there were 2 clinics that both helped women give birth. One of them was run by midwives, and one was run by doctors. And Semmelweis noticed that in one of the clinics, the one with the midwives, there were not very many deaths by childbed fever, which killed the mothers. In the clinic run by the doctors, it was a really high percentage that died of childbed fever. And he was trying to figure out what was the difference. And he looked at all kinds of different things. But what he finally came to is the midwives didn't do any work on cadavers. They didn't do any dissections, and the doctors did. And this is before anybody knew about germs. And he proposed that there was something that they got from the cadaver that then they transmitted to the mother during the birthing process that killed her. And so he came up with the idea, because they used this substance on cadavers that got rid of the smell. He assumed that somehow that got rid of whatever it was that might spread. So he had, as an experiment, he had the doctors wash their hands in this solution before they did any work helping mothers birth their children. And the death rate started dropping from this childbed fever. And it went from about 18% to almost zero. So even though he didn't really know what was happening, or at least there was no understanding of germs and that kind of stuff, he was very sure of what he saw with his own eyes. And he knew that washing hands somehow did something really good and prevented a lot of deaths. So he tried to promote this, and he was heavily criticized by other doctors. Of course, they didn't want to believe that something they're doing was killing patients. So he was ostracized pretty badly. And of course, in the end, he was right. And he helped bring in a whole new era of hygiene in the medical profession, which saved untold numbers of lives because of what he did. And he was so harassed by the medical profession that he couldn't find a job. He eventually moved back to Hungary, where he was from, Budapest, and worked in an unpaid position. And he was extremely frustrated and depressed that he couldn't get through to the doctors that his findings were real and were killing people, were killing mothers. He wrote letters to prominent doctors and kept trying to promote his idea and get people to really understand what a difference this could make and that he was right in his observations. And it took a while, but it eventually became more and more accepted. And then when it did become accepted, when there was enough evidence, when the doctors were not so defensive about this and it became accepted, it ended up really changing the world and saving the lives of untold numbers of women. Semmelweis is a hero. He did what Emerson recommends. He didn't listen to the crowd. He trusted his own observations. And that takes a certain amount of courage. I remember reading about an experiment where they had people, like somebody volunteers for the experiment. They go in there, there's 7 other people there. They showed them, supposedly all 8 of these people were experimental subjects, but actually there was only 1. The rest of them were in on it. They showed the experimental subjects, I think 3 lines, and had them determine which line was the longest, or something like that. It was very similar to that, if not that. But then they would have the other ones say what they thought first before the actual experimental subject gave his judgment, right? So, the first guy would say, I think line number 2 is the longest. And the next guy would say, line number 2, yeah, line number 2 is the longest, and then it would come to the final guy, the actual experimental subject, and he would say what he thought, right? But what they did was they did it right first couple of times, and then they all chose the wrong one, right? And then when it came to the actual experimental subject, when he was supposed to say what he thought was, and apparently it was very obvious which one was the longest one. And he, like a third of the time, these experimental subjects would say what everybody else said. Even though he could see that it was line number 3 that was clearly the longest, if the first 7 people said it was line number 2, a third of the people that did this said, yeah, line number 2 is longest, even though that was clearly and obviously wrong. So there's a certain amount of influence that other people have naturally on what you say and what you believe, and even what you observe. And it takes a bit of courage to stick with what you know, to stick with what you think in the face of opposition. And that's what Ignaz Semmelweis did, demonstrating beautifully one of Emerson's principles. Semmelweis was intensely frustrated and eventually became so depressed he had to go to a mental institution where he died. Self-reliance is not for sissies. Matter of fact, I'm going to read you a passage from my book, Self-Reliance Translated. If you were going to make a list of outstanding examples of truly self-reliant people who followed their own way, who would you put on the list? At the top of my list would be Gandhi, Lincoln, and Socrates. Many people would add Martin Luther King Jr. and Jesus. Besides being moral exemplars, what else do they have in common? They were all assassinated, executed, or forced to kill themselves. The point of this grim history lesson is that self-reliance is not for sissies. If you follow your whim, if you stay true to yourself, if you trust yourself as a taskmaster and speak the truth, some people will really not like it. Self-reliance is not a way to become popular. On the other hand, other people will be strongly attracted to your self-reliance and originality, so it's not a road to complete unpopularity either. All 5 of the exemplars above had lots of popular support. But they didn't win over everyone and didn't even try. They had enemies, and that is inevitable when you follow your own path. Some people won't like it. When you feel a conflict between living with self-reliance and living a frictionless life, or when you are motivated by your own somewhat better than whim to do something and people find it wrong or offensive, it's a good idea to remind yourself of this. You're not alone, and you're in very good company. One of the principles from self-reliance is, what I must do is all that concerns me, not what the people think. The principle reminded me of the story of Charles Darwin, who was invited to go on his 5-year voyage on the Beagle, where he made his great discovery about natural selection. His father really did not want him to go on that trip. His dad thought he was drifting into a life of sin and idleness, but he didn't listen. What I must do is all that concerns me, not what the people think. As another example, Winston Churchill's father thought that Winston was not, quote unquote, not fit for a career in law or politics because he did so badly in school. He was clearly not dissuaded by this, becoming one of the most famous statesmen in history. One of the points that Emerson makes repeatedly in his essay is that you're an expression of the universe, and the universe is infinite and infinitely creative. And there's no way that if you were really doing what you're here to do, there's no way you would imitate anybody else. The universe, with an infinite number of things to express, would not ever want to repeat itself. So envy is ignorance and imitation is suicide. And there's a really great scene in the movie Ray, about Ray Charles, where he's in a recording studio and he records some stuff and he sounds great. And the producer or engineer, whoever it is, comes out there and talks to him and says, look, man, you sound just like Nat King Cole. But there already is a Nat King Cole. Nobody wants to hear him duplicated. One of the things they love about music is something original. That's one of the things they want in music, is something original, not something like somebody else. Anyway, he really encouraged him to sound only just like himself and nobody else, and he became great. And that's one of the points that Emerson makes, is that greatness doesn't come from copying somebody else. Greatness, one of the elements of greatness is originality. One of the most famous quotes in Self-Reliance is, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines." He really goes out of his way to warn us that this drive for consistency really interferes with our ability to be honest and true to ourselves and be a real expression of the immense intelligence and greatness within. Like conformity and consistency being 2 of the biggest enemies to that. He says, the other terror that scares us from self-trust is our consistency, a reverence for our past act or word. He also said, I hope in these days we have heard the last of conformity and consistency. Let the words be gazetted and ridiculous henceforward. And on that subject, I wanted to share with you a study I read in the book Influence, where people had gone around to a neighborhood and asked if people would be willing to put a 3-inch square sign saying, "Be a safe driver," somewhere in their window or something. And almost everybody said yes. Then 2 weeks later, a different person went around to the same neighborhood and asked people if they would be willing to put a billboard sign on their front lawn saying drive carefully, a large billboard sign, right? So, and they showed them a picture. This is what it will look like. And they showed this beautiful home with this giant billboard on their front lawn, almost completely obscuring the house. And the shocking thing is, so normally, when they do that to a normal, when they just cold call a neighborhood and ask people if they would be willing to do this, very few are willing to do this. 17% said yes to putting a billboard on their front lawn that said drive carefully. 17%, right? But in those neighborhoods where 2 weeks earlier, most people in that neighborhood had agreed to put this 3-inch square sign saying be a safe driver, 76% of them agreed to put the billboard on their front lawn. So in the book, Influence, what it is basically is what it is that makes us say yes. What is it that salespeople are doing? What is it that advertisers are doing that are getting us to successfully say yes? And the book is fascinating. It's one of the few books I've read, I don't know how many times. I've read it 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. I don't even know. Because the guy is a professor, right? He's done experiments himself. He studies other sociological experiments, psychological experiments. And then he decided to take a sabbatical and see what they're teaching people in the real world about these same things that they were finding out in the laboratory, right? So he goes on a sabbatical and he gets himself hired as a salesman in all these different sales organizations to see what they're doing, what they're using, what do they train him to do in their sales organizations. And after all of that, after all his academic research and then all his real world research, he wrote the book Influence, and he narrowed it down to 6 principles of influence. These are the principles that are being used by salespeople and advertisers and cult leaders and politicians and anybody that's trying to get you to do something. These are the principles they use. And one of these 6 principles is commitment and consistency. Exactly what Emerson was trying to warn us against. That we have an inner drive to appear consistent to other people. And this locks us into what we have been before, which eliminates or at least inhibits our ability to be original and creative now. And like Emerson said, the 2 biggest, we're being pressured from without. Other people want us to be what we've been before, and they want us to be what they think we should be. So we're getting this pressure to not be ourselves and not be original and not be creative and not be eccentric, to conform to other people. We're being pressured from without to conform to other people, and we're also pressuring ourselves from within to conform to other people. We want them to like us. We want to be approved. We want to have social status. And we have an inner drive also to appear consistent to ourselves. And these are the barriers to really, truly being as great as you can be, as great as you really actually are. And most of us have dealt with this in one way or another. We come up with a goal. Our parents try to talk us out of it. We come up with an idea, maybe a new business or an invention or something, and the people we love or the people we know, when they hear about it, tell us how stupid it is. And when we have something that we think of that we really want to do, or an idea that we really want to manifest, we sometimes immediately dismiss it as being outside of our already existing opinion of what we can do, or what's possible, or what other people might think of it. The idea comes up, could be a brilliant idea, could make you $1 million, and you immediately just toss it out without hardly a second thought because of one of those fears having to do with consistency or conformity. Emerson's essay is about creativity, and it's also about integrity, and those are intimately related. It's worth remembering that whatever you do that is new and original, somebody is going to be against it, no matter how great it seems. I remember reading a good example of that. Birdseye, I think his name was Clarence Birdseye, but anyway, his last name was Birdseye, and you now know him as, Birdseye Frozen Foods, when he was first trying to perfect, because you can't just put vegetables in the freezer. You have to freeze them in a certain way to make it so that when they thaw out, they're not all mushy, right? So he experimented with it and he figured out how to do this, and then he started selling these frozen foods. And you would think this is like a completely benign thing, but there were people who were against it. That thought it was fake, that it was fake food, and it had to be bad for you. And then there was another one that was, what was his name? Borden, the guy that came up with Borden's condensed milk. And this is actually back before the Civil War. And he figured out how to make condensed milk, and I guess it was a bit of a trick, because if you heat up milk, it can taste burnt. But he found out a way how he could concentrate and condense this milk without making it burnt, and he ended up people were against it. The dairy industry was against it. You know, it's gonna cause rickets. I don't know. They had all kinds of things that were against it. So whatever you do that's new, somebody is going to be against it. Facebook, when it first came out, seemed like a completely benign thing, but there were people against it. Still people against it. Probably more people now against it than there were then. Even Bill Gates, who's been spending time giving away his money to save the lives of the poor, there are people against him. Think he's got evil plans and, so on. If you can keep consistency and conformity from restraining and diminishing you, you can fulfill your potential. Emerson said you have a great work inside you, equal in grandeur to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or the Mona Lisa or Michelangelo's David, but different from all of them, completely original and unique. And whatever that great work is, you can do that, and if you did, you would be fulfilled and deeply satisfied. You could become a force of nature if you can resist the temptation of conformity and consistency. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started.